I'm going to start by asking you a question. Who's heard of the Supply Chain Sustainability School? That's good. That's about half or slightly over. And I'm going to start with a plug because one of the things I've been working on, the Supply Chain Sustainability School is a collaboration between... Sorry? Right. The Supply Chain Sustainability School is a collaboration between 19 of the top 20 construction companies in the country and a lot of the major FM companies. It produces material and e-learning material and other material for people to use. And the aim being to drive up sustainability in construction and FM supply chains. Within the school, there's been a special interest group that has looked at modern slavery, and in that group we've worked together, people from construction and FM, to come up with a common approach for construction and FM and shared materials, so things whether it's PQQ statements, checklist of things for a company to do, or guidance on the Act for construction companies. So if you haven't already been to the supply chain school and looked at the material on modern slavery, that's a must-do takeaway from this. And it's also got links to, for example, videos from Stronger Together and so on. So a lot of really good material there for construction. If you haven't seen it, please do. But that's the plug. As I'm also going to talk as within Interserve, I'm in the Support Services division, that's the FM division, but I've been coordinating our response to modern slavery across the group. So that has got UK construction, but international construction, and there's other divisions as well. But what we're looking at in construction. And I guess one of the things that I'm going to focus on to begin with is to bring out, so what does is different about construction and FM to a lot of other industries about where slavery might occur. And it's something I don't think we've really brought out so far in the conversation we've had today. But, so I'm going to bring out what the different areas are, and then we're going to go through each of those areas in a bit more detail and talk about what the risks in the UK are. I'm going to focus on the UK stuff. I am aware of what we've done in outside the UK, but the UK is where I've done most of the stuff, and we've already heard quite a bit about international construction. So the analysis that I'm going to talk about now is what we've used at Interserve, but it's also shared. It's exactly the same analysis that has been used in the supply chain school for where are the risks in construction. And really there are 3 or possibly 4 headings in that. The first is what we do on our own site. And if you look at that, that's about our own recruitment procedures. And I guess as a group, we perceive, particularly in the UK, the risk that we're employing slaves is pretty low. We already have good recruitment procedures. We already have human rights policy and so on. So although there's a risk and we need to do things to tighten up in that area, actually we perceive that as a low risk area. Then the area that we perceive as being the highest risk is the risk that we bring, not ourselves, but through an agency or a subcontractor that we employ, that we bring slaves onto a client site. So this is clearly where we're seeing the biggest risk. And an agency, you should be clear, there's quite a different use of agency, say in the UK, where you want to get, for example, cleaners on a short-term contract or something that you're going to use an agency for, to agencies in the Middle East, where you're recruiting somebody who's going to be work for you for perhaps a number of years. So both those could come under agencies. Subcontractors is also really high risk, as we're seeing it, because they come onto the client site. And it's not just subcontractors, but it's subcontractors. So how do you actually manage that, and so on? And that's where we see in a lot of discussion that is really different from where people talk about supply chain. But of course the third area that we have risk is the supply chain. So whether that is where do we get the steel from, concrete, timber, whole load of building materials, each of those supply chains presents its own challenges. So those really are 4 areas: our own stuff, agencies, subcontractors, and then in the supply chain. And I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. So, for example, in your own operations, it's important to do things like the right to work checks, but also, for example, looking at things like, do you make multiple payments to the same bank account? That's often a sign that actually slavery is going on. So there's quite a lot to actually add there to the checks that are ongoing. Subcontractors, if we look at that, then when a white van turns up on site, what do you really know about who's in that van, who's come on site? who have you actually brought on site. And then agencies present a slightly different problem in that they will be employed as effectively to look like us, to look like Interserve people to the client, as opposed to a subcontractor doing a job, but nonetheless that's a risk. And then in the supply chain. So if we look at some of what could you do, and one of the things that make it different because you bring people on site is it's not simply about putting things in your policy and contracts, it's how you're going to spot those, whether people are subject to slavery when they come on site. So the sorts of things that we're looking at is to look at training the people who bring people on site to be aware of modern slavery, to understand what the signs of modern slavery are. We haven't done this yet, but we will be doing next year. And also to put into the site induction programme material. So when you bring an agency worker or subcontractor on site, there's already a site induction that they go through, for example, for health and safety. So one of the things that we will be doing is to put material in that talks about modern slavery and makes clear if you feel you're subject to modern slavery, this is where you can actually go to report it or to get your situation looked at. There's clearly some bits of this that have changed. So, for example, if we take agency workers, one of the things it's doing for us is to make us focus on having a smaller number of preferred agencies where we can do due diligence and we ensure that they've got the right checks in place and checks and audits in place rather than a broader number. So there's actually an impact there on the supply base. If we look at the supply chain, where you've got long, complex international supply chains, then that again is a challenge, as you've seen. How do you actually manage that when that's several tiers away? And I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. First of all, when we went out for tender for electrical wholesale, so the lights, light fittings, things like that, but a whole range of electrical wholesale, we went out to tender to the major providers in the UK and said, so we asked them the question, have you identified the ethical risk in your supply chain? And I guess where we got back to was, well, we've got some policy on that. We certainly wouldn't, we've got policy that says we won't employ slaves. We've got policy that says we won't use OECD minerals. But when you actually come back to saying, so how do you actually know whether what you've got has got OECD minerals? So that's tin, tantalanium, tungsten and gold. So actually what we found was none of the electrical wholesalers actually know at the detail line item level which of the products have got those materials in, and if they have got those materials in them, where are they sourced from? So there's a real challenge, I think, in the supply chain. It's not just about companies, but about the product, to understand where has it come from and what's the conditions it's been made under. And that, for a whole range of other sustainability issues, is going to drive up actually the demand to have that knowledge. I think also some of the thinking we've done around the supply chain is that we need to understand what we can do, because if you look at the range of things that we buy, practically anything a building will buy, we cannot be experts in all those supply chains. So we're actually going to look to our tier one suppliers to be doing to manage that forward and to make sure they do due diligence. So coming back to the electrical wholesale, we're actually working with them and putting the emphasis on them doing a good job. There's a really interesting thing that came up about micro and car paint, which we could talk about if anyone wants to ask a question about that. And what we did is a real example of slavery that was reported and how we tackled it. A few things I want to say. We've done, within Interserve, we created a risk analysis checklist around a number of things, setting out what we saw as best practice, and asked what people are doing now, what the plans are. Each of the divisions has completed that. We've put in place plans based on identifying the major gaps that we have in that, and one of those is coming back to this awareness. Do people actually know what modern slavery is? We're actually going to give everybody, in the way that everybody goes through bribery and corruption training, they will get an awareness of modern slavery. People who do the recruiting or bring subcontractors on site will get more detailed training. And a couple of final things. I think without collaboration, we aren't going to get there. If only a few of us do a good job, then actually the slavery will just go to the places where there isn't a good job done. So actually we really need to collaborate and understand how we're going to jointly prevent it or and so on. And coming back to supply chain school and what I started with there, that's a great start on the collaboration. And finally, based on some reflection on a conference that I attended a couple of weeks ago, there's been a lot of talk, and a lot of companies will have their process and policy in place. Fewer are actually doing something about it. And there's also quite a lot of good debate around what do slaves look like and how do you identify the slave? What's the victim and how should we look after the victim? The question that I've not really heard a lot of discussion is about is what do the slavers look like? Because if we actually want to prevent slavery, I think that we need to actually understand what the slavers look like and how we would go about preventing that, preventing them operating in the way they do. And if we look at it, the way the slavers operate is really different. If you look in the UK, somebody who is employing or has slaves or is using slaves, they know that they're doing something that's illegal and that breaks the social norm. Whereas if you look, say, from the Indian subcontinent, then it's clear that the cultural norm is that, for example, paying to get a job is accepted practice. So it's really different, and there's also, for example, what we've discovered as well as, if you like, that endemic pay for your job, there's also on sites, for example, the supervisor who opportunistically is going to come on his worker and say, you need to give me some money. So we need to understand those different things because how you respond to them and to prevent them is going to be different in each case. So we need to do more on that. Thank you. Apologies that I've run over.